still? I think the mics are on. I think they turn them on.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. On behalf of the Charles Koch Institute, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event with our special guest, Dr. Barry Posen of MIT. My name is William Ruger, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Policy at the Institute. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, we are a nonprofit educational institution focused on the importance of freedom and how it contributes to individual and societal well-being. We offer a number of educational programs and professional programs that have produced over 2,000 alumni, some of whom are in the crowd today, so welcome. Tonight's event centers on grand strategy, which, as Dr. Posen explains in his book that many of you have, grand strategy is a nation-state's theory about how to produce security for itself. And grand strategy is thus a key component to a state's overall foreign policy. And the question on the table tonight is, what type of grand strategy is most appropriate for the US today in order to produce the security necessary for well-being, and one that does not compromise other aspects of flourishing and a flourishing life, such as freedom and prosperity? Now, here in Washington, as you well know, elites on both sides of the aisle have agreed that the US needs a muscular, interventionist foreign policy with the following characteristics: a large defense budget, military bases and alliances all over the globe, foreign aid to states such as Egypt, military interventions to spread democracy, or as one book proclaimed, to put an end to evil. That's quite the purview, huh? And even preventive war such as in Iraq. This is the primacist argument, also referred to as liberal hegemony. Now tonight, in the spirit of expanding the national conversation on foreign policy, we're going to hear a very different argument from Dr. Posen about what type of grand strategy the United States should have. And we're absolutely thrilled to have him here, especially given his prominence in the field of international politics, which is actually my home discipline. And it's a very great moment to share the stage with someone who has produced so many fine works in that field. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Posen. He's the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT and the director of the MIT Security Studies program. Among his many important books and articles, two in particular stand out to me. One is his great book, The Sources of Military Doctrine, which is basically a staple of international relations theory, and lots of classes like civil military relations as well. And his newest book, Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy. Now, the Sources of Military Doctrine book is a seminal work, like I said, and won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Foundation Book Award, which now might be a little ironic,
It gets worse. Woodrow Wilson keeps popping up in my life.
Yeah, we can put a stop to that. Now, his op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and one of my favorites, because I read it every day as a child, the Boston Globe. And he's been interviewed frequently for the BBC and NPR and other news outlets. So it's our pleasure to host him today to discuss his new book. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Barry Posen. Now, Barry, one of the things that I think people really lose sight of, often to their peril, as I often tell my students, some of whom I see here, is the need to connect ends and means in making foreign policy decisions. So just to start us off on a sound footing, let's talk about ends before we get into the means. So what do you think are the national interests of the United States?
Well, when I think about grand strategy and I think about security, I define it narrowly. And one of the reasons I define it narrowly is because we're usually thinking about those political things, political objectives for which we would be willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, which would be war. So I think we're concerned mainly about sovereignty, which is our ability to make our own decisions, territorial integrity, which is a kind of threat the United States has not faced in quite a long time, and the safety of our people, and we all care about safety, but we should remember that states have often been willing to risk the safety of their people to protect, sovereignty and territorial integrity. And finally, we should be concerned about our power position. Concern is not the same as obsessed with it, but to be able to protect safety, to protect sovereignty, protect your territorial integrity in a world where there is no sovereign, there's no 911 to call, a state depends on its own power. So as strategists have argued for a long time, you want a comfortable surplus of power, of capabilities of various kinds, over and above what you might strictly think that you need for your own security. As you probably know, I think we've gone well beyond that.
So what are some kind of key realities of the world that act as constraints in the world or are important to this grand strategy discussion? The kind of things that you talk about in the book as strategic facts that we have to realize.
Yeah, well, there's two kinds of strategic facts. There's things that are, the facts are facts, which is the facts about the U.S. national security position, which are very good. And then there's what are really theories that I have about how the world works, which I think are pretty reliable theories. So I think those are some of the facts of the case as we go out and approach the world. It's easy to lose sight of the great position that this country has, right? We're, GDP, the economic capacity is the ore from which you distill your military power, and the United States is still the greatest economy in the world. Now, other economies are moving in the right direction from a world historical point of view, but from the point of view of U.S. relative power, some are beginning to close the gap. So as we look into the out years, it's possible, not inevitable, but possible that China will have a GDP equivalent to the U.S. India is coming along behind if things begin to break right for them, right? So it's possible the United States may have 2 or 3 peers in the out years, but we're going to be one of the best economies in the world. So this is a very good place to be from the point of view of generating military power. The second thing is, we have the oceans to the left and right, and relatively weak and pliant neighbors to the north and south. So our security position is really quite nice. And we'd like to say that, technology has erased distance and whatnot. But, if you ask the American military when they have to go somewhere else whether technology's erased distance, suddenly technology hasn't erased distance. It's a real struggle to get to other places. It's a real struggle for other places to get to us. People sometimes worry about trade and economic position. About a third of American trade, a little bit less than that, is really in this hemisphere. So when people talk about changes in the world damaging America's trade position, if you think America's trade position is fundamental to America's economic power, which is an argument, it would take enormous changes in international politics to alter the world of international trade in a way that was truly inimical to American interests. We have a fantastic military and fantastic military technological base, which literally I'm an old dog, but it's even our fathers handed down to us, our fathers and mothers handed down to us, which we really began building seriously in around 1940, and which we really never stopped working on. So we have a really great industrial base and a really great research and development capability. And we produce really good weapons, ultimately, after we make a lot of mistakes and after the costs go up and you have terrible shakedown phases. But in the end, we produce really fantastic stuff, and we have really immensely capable people in the military to do it. So this is a great tool for American security. The continent's a nice continent to be on from a natural resources point of view. Many of you lived through the time of maybe you had some gasoline rationing. We had alternate days to buy gasoline. It was just accepted that the United States would never be energy independent again. Somehow, miraculously, the continent has given us another gift, right? So that's a pretty great thing. And then finally, it's a two-edged sword, but it's a fact of life. And we live in the nuclear age. We have nuclear weapons. Other countries have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are threats to American safety, threats to the safety of everyone on the planet. But there is something about nuclear weapons that's sort of interesting from a traditional security point of view, and that is that countries that have nuclear weapons are probably not going to be conquered by anybody. Right? Nobody's going to think about trying to conquer a country that has nuclear weapons because the risks and costs are so much higher than the potential gains. It just so happens the United States has the most potent nuclear force in the world, right? Which you can measure it in a lot of different ways, and it may even be too potent by some measures. But any way you cut it, the United States is a nuclear power, and that severely limits anything anyone could do to the United States. And all these things, you combine them together, and the United States is just in a very, very good position from the point of view of national security the way I've defined it, which may be too narrow. Some people might say it's too narrow, but to me it's the basic case, it's the basic question. And from that point of view, we start out with huge assets in this country, which is why I argue in the book that those who want us to do other things have a bit of a hill to climb in making the argument, right? And that's the hill they should have to climb, that inherently the country is not so secure that we have to go out and slay some dragon somewhere. Every now and then we have, and it's been reasonable, but we seem to see a world full of many more dangerous dragons than I would see.
Right, and even if you didn't have the effects of nuclear weapons, you still have a powerful Navy and an Air Force that make that moat that you talked about even more dramatically dangerous for others.
That's correct. That's correct. We just have a very good position.
Right. Now, one traditional fear of American statesmen has been a kind of Eurasian hegemon emerging that could threaten the United States. Do you worry about that?
Yeah, well, this is the canonical problem, preserving the political division of industrial Eurasia is the way it used to be stated. And the British had this strategy before us. This is what a balance of power strategy really was on the continent. And the whole theory is that, given all the resources that are there on the continent, if somehow there was one continental hegemon, even in Western Europe, what we mainly used to worry about, that could organize all those resources, that country might be competitive and have the capabilities to overcome all those security assets that I just laid out a second ago the United States has. Now, it's still going to be pretty hard for them to do it. So this is a prudential form of behavior, right? It's still small c conservative to be worried about that issue. But if there's any issue that can bother the United States, that's the issue. Now, when you look at Eurasia writ large today, the left side, the Western side, I don't think there's a candidate for hegemony. I mean, the Russians have been obstreperous, but at the same time, if you look at the basic Russian power position relative to other European powers, it's really not that great. And they have some enduring problems that they're going to face, such as demographic problems, other kinds of problems. And they missed some opportunities. I mean, they could have retooled the economy a little bit more than they did when the Cold War ended. They took the path of least resistance and turned it largely into a resource extraction economy. They had a lot of human capital in that economy. They could have done something else, but they didn't. So there's not much of a risk, I think, of a Russian bid for hegemony. None of the other countries are really powerful enough to do it or inclined.
Now, one of the things that you've done in your career is to bring the issue of nationalism into the debate about grand strategy. And that makes it even harder to imagine a Eurasian hegemon, doesn't it?
Nationalism is it can be a great force when it's working on your side, and it's really a very dangerous force when you're working against it, right? When I talk about those enduring factors of international politics, one of the ones that I find impressive is nationalism and other forms of identity politics. Because nationalism, when we think about nations, you think about the French Revolution, right? You think maybe about Wilhelmine Germany or France or the British Empire, right? But there's more different kinds of what people in the political science business like to call identity politics, right? So we seem to be hitting a new wave of this. There's a lot of it in the world. Some's organized around nationalism, some's organized around ethnicity, some's organized around religion, but it seems to be a very powerful need that people have these days to organize their politics around some membership in some larger but still cohesive
Right, we see that in Scotland and Catalonia.
It's unbelievable. Here we are in Western Europe, a peaceful, happy place. To coin the phrase about England, the whole place is a green and pleasant land, and yet you have these very powerful nationalist identities. I actually have Catalan relatives, and believe it or not, so I have some familiarity with this. And I was in England recently during the Scottish referendum. So what are these people so exercised about? If you had to be a nation within another larger collectivity, being a part of the United Kingdom wasn't really that onerous. And of course, in the end, the referendum failed. But it's striking that you can get so much emotion. So when you mention nationalism in terms of balance of power, countries tend to resist governance by others, right? That tends to be the case. Sometimes they may blow it, right? That doesn't alter the fact that they can blow that resistance. Or sometimes if you need two countries to coalesce against a third, sometimes they're tardy or they spend a lot of time bickering. We've seen this before, right? But the basic impulse of modern politics is that countries don't like to be governed by others, and people get their backs up. And suddenly people who seem quite peaceful and uncaring can get quite concerned when they feel like they're under the gun.
Right, so a Eurasian, a bid by someone in Eurasia for hegemony, they might be able to take, but could they hold? Because you'd have to be able to hold to threaten the U.S.,
Yeah,
and that
yeah.
might be very difficult.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, we're getting academic here, but you got to be a little bit careful with that because resistance and rebellion after conquest is actually hard, right? So the place where nationalism really gives you a lot of utility
is in the first place.
In the first instance, we can get people sort of fired up to contribute to their military and pay taxes and be there. The second is harder to get going. It does happen, and sometimes when the Americans have tried to reorder the politics of other countries, we've run into the nationalist buzzsaw, as we did in Vietnam, and to some extent we did in Iraq. So it's not a pretty story, but being a rebel against a powerful occupier isn't a very pretty story either. So you don't just want to bet the whole farm on that phenomenon.
Sure. Now, you lay out an approach to grand strategy that is very different from the orthodoxy that reigns today, as I pointed out in my introduction. And you call this orthodoxy liberal hegemony. Can you walk us through what liberal hegemony is? I mean, what is this position that you find so troubling?
Yeah, it's such a large and amorphous project that it's actually hard to walk you through it. As we mentioned to you before. And actually, I think I stole the term from a friend of ours, John Eikenberry, who's I think one of the more prominent liberal hegemonists. I think he used the term in one of his books. But lately, he's backed off it. Right. Once I started using it, I think he abandoned it. Right. I think title tells all. I mean, it's a weird confluence of who we are as a people in the United States and the values and practices we've accumulated over our history, and the circumstances of the end of the Cold War, right? I mean, we competed very hard in the Cold War. I'm not sure we ever said to ourselves, we're competing to be the most powerful state in the world to reorder it for all time. We just thought we were competing to get rid of the Soviet Union or keep the Soviet Union from getting rid of us, right? But when they collapsed, which was sort of unexpected for most of us, I mean, I'm sure there's some wise person who did predict it, but I can't say I was one of it. The relative power position the United States enjoyed vis-a-vis the rest of the world was really quite extraordinary, right? And people began quickly using the term unipolarity. People who talk about the structure of international politics, international relations theory, talk about the number of important powers, polarity, right? Historically, most of world history is multipolar, right? You have a bunch of states of approximately equal capability, kind of duking it out, right? The Cold War, we had our first real case of bipolarity. We'd never seen unipolarity. We didn't even have any theory about unipolarity, right? And when this strange moment emerged, right, everyone was shocked. But one of the things that happened pretty quick is unipolarity went from an observation to a kind of a fetish, right? So it went from, gee, this is a kind of miraculous moment to, wouldn't it be great if this lasted forever? Right. So the first thing that's important to know about liberal hegemony is it does have this funny power after power for its own sake kind of quality, right? That essentially you're taking a situation that was a bit of a historical accident and you're saying, gee, this feels so great, let's keep it. Right? And then the question is, keep it for what? Right? That was the second question. Well, keep it to spread the values that we think were victorious in the Cold War. I mean, the democracies won, liberal principles won, liberal ideas won, right? So what liberal principles we're going to try to advance? Pretty much any ones we can think of. Now, we're not entirely consistent or coherent about this, and we do move and draw back, and sometimes we privilege one thing and sometimes another. And these are all good things. They work for us. Democracy works for us. Market economies works for us. Rule of law works for us. Individual rights works for us. Even international trade, open markets works for us. Even, and this is controversial, but liberal international institutions, which some people don't like, because the Americans were on the ground floor, we tend to have a little more say in those institutions, and they grease the skid. So it was. I don't want to say it was a full court press because we're doing a lot of other things over, since the Cold War ended. But the basic orientation is outward, spread our values, oppose those who seem in opposition or seem to be a rear guard for the old ways of thinking about things. So this includes, autocratic nationalists.
People preventing the end of history from happening.
People
right?
who might be, it's a good way to put it. If you're in the way of the end of history, then we're in the way of you. I think it's very true. But these things march together. In other words, that it's because you're so powerful that you can imagine you can achieve these things, right? And within the argumentation about liberal hegemony is an argument that if we use our power to structure the world exactly the way we like it, then we will continue to be really, really capable in that world. Even if sort of typical power kinds of measures begin to converge a little bit, because we control the principles of world politics, we'll have an extra fillip, right? So it's the power advantage and the liberal principles march arm in arm.
Right. Now, it sounds like a potentially wonderful world that this will produce. So what's the problem, Barry?
The problem is, as I'm sure people in the room have observed, is that the world is resistant to our administrations. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You mentioned that I guess you mentioned I was a realist. Realism's a big tent, but
right.
Realism basically worries, it observes two things about international politics. There is no sovereign, as my friend John Mearsheimer likes to say, no 911 that you can
right.
call. So this causes the states and governments to look out for themselves, right? And this has all kinds of different manifestations in international politics that we see as recurring phenomenon. And just because the Americans, who are very strong and also the good guys trying to realize what we believe to be good principles, just because that might be true, doesn't mean you're not going to face typical kinds of resistance from states who just don't like their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And
the world gets a vote, right?
Yeah, the world ends up getting a vote, and even your friends vote. So there's three phenomena that I think are identified by realism. One is the more typical one, which is balancing. Other states will try and balance your power however they can. And there's two ways they can do it. They can build up their own internal capabilities, military and otherwise, or they can concert action. And for the first 10 or 15 years of the post-Cold War world, we saw very little balancing. And one of the reasons was we were so strong, it was really hard, right? But some of that is changing. So, the Russians, which were in a terrible state when the Cold War ended, have found some leadership and have tried to pull themselves back together. They're not a superpower, but they're a consequential power. And we got used to 10 or 15 years where they really didn't have much of a say in much of anything. They more or less had to follow along. And that's obviously not true. China has been growing apace, and China's GDP at market prices is now about half ours. China's GDP at purchasing power parity is about the same as ours. Soviet GDP at purchasing power parity was never more than half of ours, right? So there's more powerful states out there. They have more ore to distill for balancing purposes, right? And they're trying to distill it, and they find each other. Now, Russia and China are not going to march arm in arm into the future, but in part, and only in part because of the fact that we push so hard, the Chinese and the Russians occasionally make common cause against us. And moreover, even when they don't, each has a space of maneuver opened up for it because of the existence of the other, right? Because the Russians know that the Chinese are able to pin down some American forces in Asia and some American attention. They have wiggle room,
right?
Because the Chinese know that the Russians are there. They have wiggle room, because each knows that it can trade with the other in extremists. They have wiggle room. Because there are landlines of communication that run across Eurasia, right? They have wiggle room. So
right.
all this creates wiggle room for others to make our project more expensive. So the project that seemed kind of cheap and interesting 15 years ago seems less cheap. Maybe to some people still is interesting, but more expensive, right? So then the question is, are we going to continue to find the resources
right.
for this, right? So balancing is one problem. The other two problems are problems you have with your allies, and these are problems that also make life more expensive, right? American allies, in economics, they call it free riding, but we typically have been using the term cheap riding. Our allies spend quite a lot less on defense as a share of GDP than the Americans do. Japan spends about 1% of GDP on defense. The Americans have been spending about 4%. The Europeans, who claim to be so concerned about the Russians, are spending 1.6, right? Well, this is a kind of, this is a problem with insurance, right? So we provide really extravagant promises to defend our allies, to help them, to ensure their security. That whenever our allies get nervous about anything and come running to us, we go, oh dear, we must do something to make the allies feel better. From my point of view, you can look at what they spend on defense, and you can tell that we've already made the allies feel really, really secure. Our problem is not that that we're losing credibility. Our problem is we probably have too much credibility. Right? So cheap riding is energized, and this tends to make, this produces a kind of a tail chase phenomenon. We spend more so they can spend less, they spend less so we have to spend more. It's this kind of circular relationship. That's another cost, right? Then there's a third problem, which I think is a phrase that I coined. I'm not sure, but I think I coined the phrase reckless driving. This is a sort of a cousin of the moral hazard arguments we've been hearing ever since the financial meltdown. Some of our friends feel so comfortable in the American embrace that they go on little adventures, including adventures that we've counseled them against, right? So both the Karzai government and the Maliki government were kind of reckless drivers. They did a lot of things that we advised them against. We predicted there would be bad consequences, and there have been bad consequences. And unfortunately, we end up owning some of those bad consequences. We have other allies. I mean, the Japanese have been a little bit reckless lately. Every time the prime minister goes to visit the Yasukuni shrine and stick a finger in the eye of the Chinese, that's reckless driving. This whole business with Daoyu Senkakus, this was reckless driving. When Israel expands settlements in the West Bank, that's reckless driving. These things have not gotten America into new giant wars, but they have so far increased our costs of doing business. So all of these things that are happening are increasing our costs of doing business, and particularly given the energy that you need to sustain if you're going to pursue liberal hegemony. So others, we're going to have to come to some sort of decision point in this country about whether or not we want to dig deeper into our pockets to support a strategy that, if you take seriously the larger strategic facts I outlined earlier, is really a strategy that we don't need to pursue for our security. We don't need to pay all these costs.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into that. I mean, you don't have to be someone who says pay any price to think that it's important to pay a necessary price when you have to secure your interests. But when we go back to where we started with our ends, the things that you mentioned, homeland security, our kind of American way of life, if you will, our territorial integrity, our sovereignty. Does going around the world in search of monsters to destroy, as John Quincy Adams put it, is that necessary? Are those monsters really dangerous to those things? And how much do we really have to do? Which I think gets to the question of, what does restraint look like? I mean, what type of activism should we have in the world, and what should we be restrained from doing to secure our interests?
Yeah. Well, restraint's a big tent. Some of my restrainer friends believe I'm not restrained enough. I think there are three problems that America needs to pay attention to, and these are all problems that people on the other side, the liberal hegemony side, also believe we should pay attention to. So sometimes you get into a question of sort of operational level strategy or tactics, right? And defining the problem. So I continue to believe that we need to pay close attention to the balance of power in Eurasia. As I mentioned, I don't think there's a problem in the European side, and I think we can pass a lot of those responsibilities to the Europeans, and things will be just fine. China's growth does give me pause, and I think we have to be vigilant about the potential that's inherent in China's growth and what kind of challenges could be mounted in the future. But things are not so serious now that we have to rush the net for a new strategy of containment. There are potential partners out there in Asia who can do a lot more to deal with China if it becomes a big problem. And as I like to say, if in some sense the best case from China's point of view and maybe the worst case from everyone else's were to come true, which is these linear projections of China's growth rate actually come true, then China will have quite a lot more economic potential than the United States does. Now, I actually doubt that this will ever happen. People who talk about development are quick to point out there are many bumps in the road that China could encounter, but nevertheless, there are people out there who make the other argument, right? And if this comes to fruition, then if indeed China needs to be contained, then we will not be able to do it the way we contained the Soviet Union. As I mentioned earlier, we had about twice the GDP of the Soviet Union at purchasing power parity, more than twice at market prices if we'd ever tried to value it at market prices, right? The Chinese will have a much bigger base from which to distill power. So if we get to the point that China needs to be contained, the Americans are going to need what I call real allies, right? Mostly what we have is security dependencies, helpers, folk to whom we've made promises, who have been able to underspend and undercontribute. And if the worst case, from our point of view, happens in the future, we're not going to be able to deal with China in the way we dealt with the Soviet Union, where we carry all the weight of the load and we can succeed. Essentially, a lot of countries are going to need to collaborate. And my view is, while things are safe, it's time to, things are comparatively safe, this is a good time to try and get allies in Asia used to the idea that they have to stand up and pay an important part of the price of their own security.
Sure. So what does restraint...
But there are two other things I could talk about, but if you want me to, or you want to go on or not. Right?
Well, I mean, I'll let you decide, but let me throw this in there, which is, what should we not do in a restrained with a restrained grand strategy? Because it's as much about what we shouldn't do as what we should.
Yeah. Well, there are two things that I believe we should do, and both of those have led folks on the liberal hegemony side of the argument to believe in significant uses of force. Now, I agree with them that there are problems. So the question is, how do you define the problem and how do you define solutions? So there are two other problems. One is nuclear proliferation, and one is the risk of larger terrorist events energized by nihilistic groups who take advantage of the openness of the world system to try and get at folk whom they identify as enemies. Now, the solutions that are often offered for this are when another country decides it wants nuclear weapons and we don't want it to, first we ask it nicely not to have nuclear weapons, and then we threaten to attack it, and then if we're not satisfied, we do attack it, right? Now, this seems to me to be overreaction. Preventive war is an expensive business, not just because you have to wage the war, but if you really want to determine the security policy of the country, you probably have to reorganize the government, which means you're back in occupation world, which means you're back, dealing with mobilized nationalisms, and you're often dealing with mobilized nationalism in places where identity politics is really already well stirred up, right? So when I think about nuclear weapons, I come back to the idea of deterrence and the American nuclear deterrent. And I think the real problem is, or I should say, the way I conceive the problem is that we should be interested in doing what we can to keep nuclear weapons in the hands of states who can be deterred and out of the hands of groups who may not be deterrable. Not be deterrable.
And you don't have to use preventive war.
Preventive war, no. There's two things you need to do, right? Pretty much, almost every state has an interest in nuclear weapons not falling into the wrong hands, the hands of non-state actors with big dreams. So there's potential for collaboration there, and that has both a kind of an international security component of policing, smuggling, and whatnot, but it also has to do with best practices for the safety and security of your own nuclear energy infrastructure and your own nuclear weapons. And by the way, we have problems sharing best practices now because the structure of the liberal order for arms control makes it very difficult for nuclear weapon states of the original 5 that were agreed to be nuclear weapon states in the NPT to give advice to the other 4, right, who are not agreed nuclear weapon states in the NPT. There's no arms control agreement where the 5 and the 4 come together and basically say, we need to have discussions about what I call nuclear hygiene, right? How you keep your weapons clean and safe and pure, right? And that matters a lot, I think, from a safety point of view. Now, I don't think the odds of a lost nuclear weapon are very high, or the odds that a terrorist group would find a way to use it, but given the consequences, I think it's reasonable and prudent for us to do these measured things. The same is true about terrorism. And the Americans have this idea that the way to eradicate terrorism is to get out amongst them. We had this debate in the Bush administration, and we were having it again in the Obama administration over ISIL. It's we must be on the offensive against terrorism, on the offensive against terrorism. Well, being on the offensive against terrorism usually involves going to places that are already riven in one way or another by some sort of identity politics competition, right? Often governed by folk that were not very nice to start with, and starting all over again to try and generate democracy, usually in places that are armed to the teeth, and there's a lot of people who know how to fight, and some who are willing to die, and some are willing to kill. And you end up with these in some sort of counterinsurgency nation-state building project. And to me, this is, aside from the cost, I think that we've actually kind of run the experiment, and it turns out that, I will exaggerate here, that being out there among them, running these armed state building efforts, tends to produce resistance almost as quickly as it eliminates it. So maybe you make some friends, but you make some new enemies. Maybe you eliminate some enemies, but you make new and smarter enemies. I mean, we end up running, I think in both Afghanistan and Iraq, we ended up running a kind of, Darwinian military training school for the saltiest people on the other side, right? Because, the ones who aren't very good at opposing us end up being killed. The smart ones survive. We often capture those people and put them together in jails. They get to know each other where they exchange best practices on how to fight us. They often make new friends who will come back to fight us again. Many of these people in ISIL are people that are known to us, at least is my understanding. I don't have clearances, I don't work in that area, but if you read the newspapers, many of these people are known to us, right? They pass through our jails, and we talk a lot about Ba'athist officers being at the core. These are people who fought us as insurgents. I will not be that surprised if we begin to turn up people on the other side who were trained by us, right? Who were trained in the Iraqi army when we were trying to build that army, and then after, because of Maliki's, nuttiness, basically drove those people out, and those people went over the other side. So
it's an unintended consequence of liberal hegemony.
It's a cycle of unintended consequences, and then you're generating more threats to your safety. So we've done a lot in this country, maybe too much, to build barriers between us and energized terrorists, right? So we have lots of surveillance. Every time we go to the airport, we go through these rituals. We've spent, Lord knows how much money on the intelligence business. And if you add up all the money we spent since 2001 on intelligence and look at what the increment was that was associated with ISIL, I'm sure there's several $100 billion that's gone into building intellectual capital to deal with jihadi terrorism and building an infrastructure to collect information. So we've done a lot to defend, and we have a lot of other countries in the world, they don't want to be hit by this either. So there's lots of ways to build barriers between them and you.
And is restraint a way to get the target off our back, so to speak?
Well,
or at least minimize the extent to which terrorists want to attack the U.S.?
Yeah, this is very hard. It's very hard to prove the point, right? But my suspicion is that the energy and presence in other people's politics that's generated by this foreign policy that we've had tends to mobilize some percentage of folk against us. Now, people are looking for reasons why their societies aren't either what they think they should be or what they imagine in their minds their societies once were, right? And they have plenty of local enemies to blame, but it helps attract some blame to us by being as omnipresent as we are in their lives, right? And I believe, though I cannot prove, that lowering the American profile will to some extent cause the politically energized local actors to focus more on their local enemies than they will on us. Now, is this the main reason why I want to be more restrained? No, I don't think it works, but I also think there's potentially a positive gain on the enemy side, right? Maybe it attracts fewer enemies.
So back to the question of what would you not do with restraint? So what do you think are the things that liberal hegemonists want to do that a restrainer should rightly give advice to the prince, so to speak, to avoid?
Yeah, well, the simplest ones is, or Don't try and reorganize other people's politics at gunpoint. This is the first and the simplest. These projects seem so easy going in, right? We have lots of good ideas. We have lots of resources. The situations appear to be pretty awful. We've got to be able to make them better. This is the way we think about things. And it just doesn't work out. And when I say these things are expensive, the United States spent, in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars, on the immediate costs of the Iraq War. We spent a little bit more than we spent on the immediate costs of the Vietnam War. Now, that's really strange, right? I mean, the bad guys, the opposition in Vietnam, they had open charge accounts in the arsenals of the Soviet Union and the arsenals of China. The bad guys in Iraq are basically running off whatever cash Saddam Hussein had squirreled away, whatever they can get from extortion rackets. Some had a little bit of help from Iran, but basically it's a homegrown insurgency living off what was there. And nevertheless, we had to spend all this money. I mean, if you try and convert it to a dollar cost exchange rate, which is pretty squishy, but I tried to do it one day just for fun, maybe we spent 10 or 20 times what the other side spent in the Vietnam War. Maybe we spent 100, 200, 300 times what the other side spent in the Iraq War. I mean, this isn't looking good, right? And we don't really know why this happened. I mean, you can't break down the components of spending, at least I can't. I haven't tried to do it, and it may be doable, but I haven't done it. What drove the cost? We can guess about what some of them are, but the trends are not good, right? Now, as a consequence of some of the money we spent and other things, the Americans lost many fewer soldiers dead in Iraq than it did in Vietnam. But there's a lot of things that happened to American soldiers in Iraq that might have killed them had it happened to them in Vietnam, didn't kill them in Iraq. So there's a lot of people living with serious wounds. And there's a lot of wounds we didn't get a good look at, but which we're now beginning to see the consequences of. So the costs alone, right, are non-trivial. And the second thing I would say is, this makes me very unpopular with some of my friends, is you want to think hard before you knock over an autocrat, right? I have no love for these people, but they're often sitting on a kind of I don't want to say powder keg, but they're sitting on a big wrestling match that wants to happen, and they are the local 911. They're not a nice one, but they do keep a rough order in their own societies.
So you're thinking about a place like Libya.
You knock over a sovereign in Libya. You knock over these autocratic sovereigns in Iraq. And if you don't understand the local politics, the odds of some new fight or series of fights being energized are quite high, right? And it's become an old saw of the American discourse in the last 20 years that these ungoverned spaces are hatcheries or bases or something for terrorism. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But if our policies are creating the hatcheries, maybe we should stop doing that, right? We should think carefully about it. And these are difficult moral and ethical questions, right? When some of these leaders are quite vicious to their own people, right? But to use American air power and recreate the state of nature is not going to produce humane outcomes either. So then the humanitarian argument begins to require not only knocking over the sovereign, but governing the society. So you're back governing societies and introducing new polities by bayonet point in the same way that you are when you go out to sort of fight terrorists that way. So there's a totally different causal chain that can get you to the same place, right? So these are things to avoid.
And there's a real knowledge problem about understanding how to do it well, right?
Well, the people who believe in it believe they have the knowledge, right? I mean, there's been this debate about counterinsurgency and nation and state building and development and the whole.
Hayek would call that the fatal conceit, though,
the whole of government approach. We have a lot of language, and people think they have cause-effect knowledge, but I tend to, my perception is we don't usually understand the internal politics of these countries very well, so we don't really anticipate well what's going to happen.
And we could be used by some of those people for nefarious
This is the
purposes.
same story about reckless driving and cheap and free riding.
Yeah.
Anytime someone can rent the U.S. Air Force for an afternoon for not much price, they're going to do it, right? And it's a funny way of saying it, and I'll always seek a laugh when I can get it. But there's a darker story here. I mean, the leaders of some insurgent groups. This is part of their strategic portfolio, to go out and get some of their own people killed. They will mount rebellions that they know they can't win in the hopes of producing some set of events that may energize intervention by outsiders, right? And I think this phenomenon is known and understood, but there's a profound tendency to kind of bury it when it's happening because people develop a kind of affect towards the problem. It's whenever there are rebel groups, we always kind of want to identify with them. They're the founding fathers, and especially if they're fighting an autocrat, right? It's only when they're fighting us that suddenly they're bad, right? When they're fighting some other autocrat, it's good they're fighting us.
Well, then they're terrorists.
Yeah, there's something. There's something.
So I hope someone maybe in the Q&A will ask about what this means for the defense budget, for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force. But I'm going to conclude before we go to the Q&A by asking you, for those people in the audience that this is the first time they've heard about Restraint, they should certainly read Barry's book, and we've provided that for you to kind of continue the education outside of this room. But who are some of the other voices that they might want to look at, to read as an alternative to the liberal hegemonists who they can read pretty much anywhere?
Yeah, well, a good many people who inhabit the realist school are, not all, by the way, there are disagreements, but a good many. My old friend John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago tends to that direction, although he's quite worried about China, probably more worried about China than I am. I have to talk about some of my former students at MIT, some of whom have gone on. Eugene Goltz, who's teaching at Lyndon Johnson School. Josh Rovner, who's the Tower professor at SMU. These are people who write about it. Fewer in the press. Our friends at the Cato Institute tend to be sympathetic to Restraint, and they write good, punchy pieces.
Yeah, Chris Preble.
Yeah, Chris Preble is very good. In the press, it's not so good. In the commentariat, it's not so good.
You don't see a lot of restrainers at the Wall Street Journal, do you?
Not at the Wall Street Journal, but you don't really see them at the New York Times. Every now and then you'll see someone who, I like to see Tom Friedman because I think Tom Friedman is basically a liberal hegemonist in his bones. But he's seen so many things go wrong that about every 15th or 20th column, you'll see some, a little bit of sort of restraint thinking will begin to creep into the column, right? I think in one of his columns he was talking about what sounded like reckless driving. He was using the simile, your friends don't let friends drive drunk, or you'll drunk driving. He was talking about that, right? So there's some of that, but you find, I think, you find more in academics. I am heartened by the fact that journals, like Foreign Affairs, which have basically been pretty much the voice of establishment, do reach out to try and get a different view, right? They've been reaching out to get a different view. They asked me to do a piece, they asked John to do a piece. So pieces are appearing. So I think, these ideas are getting a little more traction than they once did.
Yeah, we shouldn't forget about the national interest as well. Which
national interest is one, So. Before we close this part, I just want to say thank you for organizing this, and thanks to the Koch Institute. This has been fun. I know you want to go to Q&A.
Well, great. Well,
I just wanted to say that before.
It's been our pleasure. I mean, it's really nice to kind of open the conversation because it's oftentimes too narrow, and we really need a kind of a republic in which there's lots of voices speaking about this.
That's why I wrote the book.
Great. So let's go to Q&A now. So we have some runners that will help us with identifying questions.
Hi, I'm Nigel Ashford with the Institute of Humane Studies at George Mason. You started by identifying the national interest, the features of it, and one of them was sovereignty, the ability to make your own decisions. In what circumstances is it ever legitimate to surrender national sovereignty to an international organization, for example, NATO, WTO?
Well, you're kind of asking the wrong guy. I'm not sure I would call those actual surrenders of sovereignty. I mean, I think that, you're agreeing to a set of rules from which you can defect if and when you wish to defect from them, right? These alliances don't last, forever, right? There are situations where, a collective enterprise is going to work better than individual ones. NATO is kind of in our blood and in its origins, and I'm not sure the Americans surrendered much to NATO, but NATO allies did surrender some things to us, right? And it was a bargain that they were always uneasy with, because essentially they farmed out their defense effort to us, and we had different ideas about how to do it, and sometimes our ideas were pretty hair-raising from their point of view, right? You may remember the heyday of theater nuclear war ideas particularly in the 1950s, where how are we going to defend you? We're going to spread nuclear weapons all over the landscape until the Russians stop coming. Well, whose landscape? Well, your landscape, right? So they lived with that bargain, right? But they did it because they had to, right? They had to surrender that piece to protect the larger piece. So that's not a very good answer, but I think it's the best I can do for it.
Hi, sir. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It seems like from what you've said today, and I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I read the
You didn't read it while you were sitting there.
I read the inside cover.
It's only 175 pages.
I came close.
I'm really a clear writer. You could have done it.
I skimmed it. So it seems like it's a lot of the strategies in the 60s and 70s are still in place today that make up that equation for a liberal hegemony. So my question is, I guess in the 21st century, how much room do you think there is for public choice in that equation? Just factors like rent-seeking, bureaucracy, things like that.
Yes, the infrastructure from the Cold War is still in place, and it's one of there was a moment, my colleague Harvey Sapolsky, who actually coined the term restraint and wrote the first article about it in the 90s. When the Cold War ended, Harvey just kept saying, we have to have a parade. If we can only have a victory parade, we can get this thing over with, right? And when he saw we weren't going to have a parade, he said, "Oh boy, are we in trouble?" Right? So yes, not only did we keep those institutions in place, in the case of NATO, we grew it, we grew the business, right? And we relabeled the business and found new projects. And I think one of the reasons was that NATO was I actually happened to be in Brussels. I was living in Brussels for almost a year. In 2002, 2003, and NATO has these periodic crises about what are we for, what do we do? But there was this idea that people said, NATO's a really great brand. It's a great brand, right? And the truth is, it is a great brand, and I think it's one of the reasons why the United States likes it, right? I think when the United States government, when liberal hegemonists want to sell a particular action, one of the things they like to do is talk about the allies, because the American people are not that interested in paying attention to foreign affairs, so they kind of know what an ally is. They've seen World War II movies, and they have this image of the British and whatnot, so they don't have a good sense of when we have allies, it's not quite the same, right? You have people who send a little something to the fight, right? But they're not sending nearly what you might like, but it makes the idea of the fight seem more durable. I think American public uses this as a kind of a quick and dirty litmus test. So you've got allies, it means somebody else thinks it's smart. You've got allies, the cost should be shared. So that's great. So NATO, I think the Americans like it a lot because it's basically a little puddle of legitimacy for any project we can get NATO implicated in, right? So I think one of the things I argue for in the book is we do have to revisit these alliances, right? I think it's past time to do it. Now, whether or not we can have a larger debate in this country about it, right? In other words, you can actually get the public involved. I'm not really sure. You're right that the alliances are comfortable for the bureaucracies that run them. They're comfortable planning tools. They're comfortable tools to rationalize resources. They're very comfortable from a point of view of basing, and when the American military wants to go someplace, they like having these bases everywhere. So there is a bureaucratic interest. So what we need to do is surface costs, surface more information about the allies' behavior, surface more information about what we do and do not get for these things, and what it means when we say the Allies are involved and what it doesn't mean, right? And that's something that you need a kind of a counter-elite to do, because when I talk about liberal hegemony as U.S. grand strategy, I think we have quite a consensus across the foreign policy elites of the two parties. I don't think there's a big argument, right? So this is kind of insurgent warfare, right? And they practice counterinsurgency. I mean, they've been working on it for 20 years. So to wage,
they call you isolationists is what they do, right?
They do. They call me names. They call me an isolationist, and they always they trot out the 1930s. That's what they do.
Yep.
It's always 1935.
Munich.
So I'm babbling here, but you've opened the door to a big set of issues.
So my question has to do with how you square the very positive perception of U.S. power that you began with, that we're a very strong economy, very strong military, we have all the security around us, with your kind of also optimistic perception of U.S. threats. You say that the U.S. has to worry about balancing cheap riding and reckless driving, but you say those really aren't that big a problem because, well, no one is really balanced against us. The cheap balancing, I mean, so yeah, we're paying a little bit more. It seems to me that there isn't a material limit to U.S. power through liberal hegemony. So even if we're spending a lot on Iraq, we're spending a lot on Afghanistan, it hasn't bankrupted us, it hasn't really decreased our security, so then why is this a big deal? What is the main reason we need to fear liberal hegemony if there isn't a material limit to U.S. power?
Well, there's several questions embedded in that question. One of the things I talk about a little bit in the book, and it's not really original to me, is this idea comes out of the National Intelligence Council and these studies they've been doing every 5 years or so, doing out-year projections of what's going to happen in the world. And they have a notion they call the diffusion of power, which talks about not only the economic growth of other countries, in other words, these out-year convergence of economic potential that you see in a handful of great powers, right, as well as the diffusion of capacity out there in the rest of the world. So the point that I try and make is the costs were pretty manageable in the 90s, somewhat less manageable in the thousands, and they're going to be even less manageable in the coming decades, right? Because there's just more capability out there to oppose us, right? And because there's more capability, others are going to be more inclined to oppose us. It's not going to seem so crazy and costly to them to oppose us. They're going to oppose us through alliances. They may oppose us through war. And as they generate their military power to continue this project, we will have to generate still more military power, right? So that's my notion is that we've seen inklings and hints of all the problems I lay out. So far, we've been able to surf this wave, but I don't think we're going to be able to surf this wave forever. And then second, right, it generates, I think, political antipathy. Will was talking about it earlier. I think American presence in other places, particularly in a time period where, for whatever reasons, identity politics seems to be a more potent force, tends to turn a lot of folk against us, which creates still more trouble for the United States. And the final question we have to ask is a different one, right? In other words, we know from World War II and we know from the Cold War that a modern industrial economy can generate could divert 40 or 50% of the GDP to war if it wants to, for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, right? And we don't know much about exactly how that would work in a more service-oriented economy, but I'm guessing we could do something like that again. In the years of the Cold War, which were peaceful years, we allocated 10% of GDP to defense, right? So could we do it now if we had a political consensus to do it? Could we pay these blood prices, which we would pay in these interventions? Sure we could. But another question we have to ask ourselves is, what does our domestic politics really support right now in terms of a consensus on generating the new resources that would be required to pursue this policy against increasing resistance? And here I think it's an open question, right? If you look,
there's going to be trade-offs, right?
Yeah, no, there's going to be trade-offs. And we for the last several years we've had sort of this these budgetary fights every year or so that have to do with when and how we're going to deal with a problem that's going to come up in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. depending on which projections you believe and when the projections were made, about the debt to GDP ratio in this country and what that does to your room for maneuver in terms of internal economic management, right? Now, when at the nadir of our out-year projections, it looked like we had to move 6% of GDP around in this economy to make the numbers come out right. In other words, we had to either raise 6% of GDP in taxes or reduce 6% of GDP in spending. Now, one way or the other, a compromise was going to take a little bit from the military, a little bit from social programs, a little bit from taxes. And some of this we already did. So actually the out-year projections are not as bad as they once were. But still, as you look out there, there's several percent of GDP at some point that you probably need to move. Even liberal economist Paul Krugman will still concede somewhere in his columns that while the wolf is no longer at the door on this problem, as you look into the out years, there is a problem. Now, he says, let's leave it for the out years. Well, maybe we can, but the problem is there, right? So that question becomes, is your domestic politics going to produce an answer that says, oh, we're not only going to leave the military at 3 or 4% of GDP, we're going to add 1% or 2% of GDP to it, we're going to raise more taxes, and we're going to cut social programs. Is this the political equilibrium in this country now? Is this the plausible political equilibrium in the out years? Now, if you look at polling, and I'm not a pollster, I don't pretend to be a great expert on it, but there's some new studies out. I think it's the Project on Defense Alternative or something like that has a new survey of a bunch of different polls that have been done looking at trends over the last 15 or 20 years. Holding aside the blip we have on American public support for doing some damage to ISIL, the general trends of American public are that they're not as interested in foreign affairs as they once were. They're not as interested in international threats as they once were. So if you need to go to them for more money, and you need to go to them for more sacrifice of soldiers, I'm not sure there's a story now, right? So there are domestic political reasons why you might want to begin thinking about an alternative grand strategy relative to trends in international politics.
My name's John Glazer. I work at the Koch Institute.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the maritime and territorial disputes in the East China and South China Seas, and the extent to which a policy of primacy exacerbates tensions in the regions or makes conflict more or less likely. Secondly, if you can just talk about...
A whole second question.
implementation. I'd see several daunting obstacles to torquing policy in the direction of restraint.
You only see several.
Well, some of them have more cynical implications than others, so I wonder if you can talk about that.
And I want to add to this because we have something from Twitter here, so we're...
Oh, dear.
Yeah, we're 21st century. So adding on to this issue of China, basically what does containment mean for China, or what might it mean? And I think adding on to that, how does restraint deal with the China question, especially given what we talked about in terms of those strategic facts? Yeah. So do those facts mean that we don't have to do as much as a lot of even some of the more hawkish restrainers might think?
Well, I mean, look, you're dealing with out-year projections about both capabilities and intentions, both of which are amorphous. So I think what we have to do is go with what we've seen historically, which is as states grow in power, they tend to want a bigger say over how international politics is organized, right? Every now and then a state has grown in power sufficiently that they want all the say in how international politics is organized. We can't know if China is going to reach this point or not. Now, in ancient times, people used to think about preventive war in situations like this, but it's hard to think about preventive war against a country that's as large as this, which has nuclear weapons. So there's no preventive war answer here. So some people would say, well, we should organize containment now, right? Well, what exactly are you containing now? And don't you run the risk of pressing too hard now in such a way that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy? You're convincing China that as it rises, and as it begins to ask for more of a say in international politics, that they're just not going to get it. They're latecomers, they don't get it, right? This is probably not smart, right? I mean, some arrangements are going to need to be changed, right? And that's a fact. But at the same time, if, as could happen, China's demands become excessive, then it would be time to oppose them. So you have to be able to ride two horses at the same time. Now the question is, should we be rushing the net to containment now? I don't really see the reason for it. And I think we have to understand that some of our potential coalition partners in Asia, they kind of like to poke the dragon. And I don't, they're a little bit reckless. And I think we have to be
So does that
careful.
get to his question?
This cuts to this question of some of the business about the South China Sea, about which I'm not an expert, so I will surely make a mistake in anything I say. But there's no doubt that the Chinese have sharp elbows, and there's no doubt that they're trying to exert the maximal claims that they can get away with. Although, as I understand it from people who look at Law of the Sea treaty, the treaty is sufficiently amorphous in some places that the Chinese can make a case for much of what they're doing. It's not that that's the only case that could be made. Others can make an alternative case and do, right? But it's sort of premature to view this as sort of being an indicator of really significant malign intent. Now, the Americans have to stand back and ask for what are our interests, what's our problem here, right? Now, I think we want to be really careful about taking the part of small countries who themselves are making pretty significant claims by Law of the Sea standards. Like Vietnam's own claims are about as crazy as China's, right? I mean, you look at the maps that they draw on the lines, and the Vietnamese have had a habit of kind of poking the dragon a little bit, right? And if to listen to the way Americans talk about Vietnam today, you might imagine that we won the Vietnam War. And they're like American allies, and so these are all. I mean, I think suggested in your questions is the idea that we should take great care in which of these disputes we pick up and how quickly we pick them up. That said, we do have a larger interest, right? Our larger interest is we do have interest in freedom of navigation. That's true. We do have interest in maintaining the autonomy of the states that live along the first and second island chains. If, in the fullness of time, the Americans ever do find themselves in a struggle with China, all of that geography turns out to be very useful in a naval war. So we do have to take care. We have to be prudent. But at the same time, the usual American habit on things like this, if something's worth doing, it's worth overdoing, and overdoing it in public. And we should have done we should have done some things and done them in private. The Chinese would have understood the message, but instead we've turned it into something else. And it's interesting to me that this is probably a bit unfair, but I think shortly after the Americans announced the pivot, the Australians cut their defense budget, right? So this is not a good sign, right? And the Japanese are promising to increase their defense spending, but it's like little bits, right? So, you can already see the cheap riding as well as the reckless driving happening, and we're kind of gullible, right? And I think when we go after it's perfectly fine for America to pursue its own national interests, and we should be more careful about judging what those are. Now, your question about sort of obstacles, I have a little discussion in the last 2 pages of the book where I say, okay, so why did I write this book? I wrote the book for the reason that Will said, which is, to me, it just we had a kind of a chorus, right? I mean, Democrats, Republicans, Tweedledee, Tweedledum. I mean, there are some things that they disagree about, and they disagree about really intensively. So they imagine they really disagree. Like they disagree about liberal international institutions, right? Republicans only like the ones that we clearly run, like NATO, and Democrats like other ones which we surreptitiously run. So this is a kind of a weird dispute, but this is a giant dispute about small things. So I thought we needed an alternative perspective, and I had colleagues who had started this argument, and I was not in this argument originally. I mean, I've changed. I mean, when the Cold War ended, you can read stuff that I wrote in the 90s, and people said, well, you seem to be in this camp called selective engagement, which is a kind of a cautious forward kind of strategy. And I left that camp in part because I came to understand that cautious forward was really not going to be what we were going to be, and people who were still my good friends, who were, leaders in advancing that strategy, we now just disagree, right? So you need an argument of if we're going to live in this liberal democratic society, we should have disputes, and the arguments need to be made. And that book isn't, this book that you all have in front of you, it's not the last word on the subject. It's a conceptual framework for thinking about these things. And I hope other people produce other conceptual frameworks and explore different pieces of mind. Now, how do these ideas take hold? I have, there's 3 models, right? And each one of them has some peculiarity to them. One of them is like the eureka moment model, right? Which is that some presidential candidate has a eureka moment, manages to win with the eureka moment, manages to find enough restrainers to staff his administration with, which is going to be nearly impossible, right? Right? Hiring Crazy Barry. So this is very unlikely, right? This is a kind of, sometimes, for some reason, it's what people imagine that I imagine, and I think that's because they somehow imagine that ivory tower academics have these delusions of grandeur or something. Right? I don't really imagine this outcome at all. But the second is, is related to what I said earlier about having a debate. Right? We went through a very bad economic patch, and you can everybody's entitled to their own opinions on the various strategies we pursued and who pursued them. I think we were fortunate that Ben Bernanke, historian of the Great Depression and the Great Contraction, and particularly historian of 1931 and what happened when bank liquidity dried up. We were fortunate to have this guy at the helm and a few other people who basically said, look, I don't care what you think, we just have to flush money into the system or there's going to be real trouble. We could have had a really, really serious depression, right? It was entirely possible, right? And the question you have to ask is, if one black swan can walk across your lawn, then maybe a second black swan can walk across your lawn. Right? And if something should happen to cause a major reassessment of how much power and interest, how much power the United States has, and what its interests are in the rest of the world, some new crisis, it could be another economic crisis, it could be some strange turn on our own politics, it could be something terrible that happens in the natural world, but if anything happens that causes us to suddenly want to reconsider what we've been doing, it'd be a good idea to have thought it through, right? Now, I don't want to get changed this way. I'm just saying that this is another way that it could happen. It's another thing to think about. Then the third is, the typical way we do things in this country, which is, what some political scientists years ago called disjointed incrementalism, right? And I think we've sort of been doing disjointed incrementalism for the last 6 or 8 years, not really thinking about all the reasons why we've been doing it. And I'm guessing we'll do some more because of these big facts embedded in American domestic politics, embedded in the costs of the wars, embedded in the rising power of others. We're going to just find the room for maneuver shrinking. And at some point, someone might say, maybe it would be good for us to stop and think about where we're going now, right? And I don't think that's going to happen, by the way, but that's another path to restraint. And even if there's no kind of synoptic understanding, right? So, maybe we have to switch horses after a certain number of incremental steps. Just having ideas out there that support a direction for incrementalism, I think, is a good idea. So those are the 3 models of change I have. None of them are perfect. I think the third one, incrementalism, is the most likely. And it depends greatly on whether I've read the tea leaves properly, right? And I may not have read the tea leaves properly. The United States has a way of bouncing back, and others have a way of drifting into even more trouble than we do. So, the worm could turn, and we could look up 10 years from now and say, gee, the unipolar moment is just going to go on forever. God watches over fools drunks in the USA.
Well, I think this kind of end on the importance of ideas and kind of introducing ideas into the debate is exactly why we hold these events. And so this is a great way to end. And I really appreciate everyone coming tonight to talk to Dr. Posen and him for coming and kind of in this spirit, really kind of opening, in many ways, a debate around this country about foreign policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. That was a lot of fun.